Welcome to the series of tutorials by Clinical Eye Openers. My name is Dr. Wertelicki, and my associates are listed on the right, and without whom these tutorials would not exist. Here we present a tutorial on genetics, teratology, and dysmorphology in brief. This is an international version. A Ukrainian version can be found in the context of the CEO website. Before we open the presentation, I'd like to call your attention to 2 points. These modules stress images, signs that we can interpret as signals. However, these modules are insufficient for the formulation of diagnosis or healthcare protocols. Just as indicated before, the goal is to enhance the development of the clinical eyes, a clinical skill necessary particularly in the clinical discipline of dysmorphology. So we present video recordings that can be seen as virtual clinics, as practicums. We also offer here flexible pathway to view these materials. A basic pathway, particularly relevant to medical students, interns, residents, but also concurrently a fuller path for interns and residents, neonatologists, and pediatricians who may be more interested in this subject than others. Regarding instructors, course masters, lecturers, they can find in CEO materials that they can adapt to their own lectures and styles of exposition. Before we start, I have a comment about the optimal mode of viewing these materials. We offer verbal explanations to facilitate the examination of images as well as the grasp of what is explained in written form. To avoid a conflict between listening and viewing, I suggest that first you listen and then stop the motion. Explore and examine the images as long as you wish. Restart the motion. That will take you to the next frame, and repeat this process as needed. So we can practice here. There is little need to stop the motion to read this frame simply because there is not much written in it, nor is there an image. So don't stop the motion, let it continue. But should that be a slide like the next one, full of written explanations plus containing an image, you may have to do so. Aristotle is the father of biology, and much of what we know about dysmorphology. He asserts that there is nothing contrary to nature, including monstrosities, that is, malformations. Everything is a distortion of a natural process, not a de novo pathway. Now, very often you're going to find the term variant separated from normal and abnormal. Statistically, 95% is what we call normal, and 5% or more sometimes we call what is variant or frankly abnormal. This is confusing, and I suggest that you remember that statistical concepts have very often a difficult role to play in medicine, because regardless of these terms, what impacts health can never be normal. Even if it is 50% frequent in a population, those who suffer an impact on their well-being or otherwise homeostasis cannot be classified as normal. Please stop the motion, read that again, and then look at this image of this cyclops. Very often in the literature, particularly English literature, you're going to come across the term congenital malformations. We don't like this. We prefer to call it developmental anomalies. It is a broader term. Not all developmental problems are congenital, and not all of them are malformations. In fact, most of them are functional. I like to remind you that the word teratology comes from monstrosity or terata, a study subject of teratology. In fact, the true meaning of this word is not monster, but it is message of deities, is something we should pay attention to. It's a divine message to call our attention to the power of nature. We rely on fine arts images just like this one because artists are very talented in impacting our memory. I am sure you're not going to forget this image. You're not going to forget this little cyclops. He speaks to you better than any photograph. And the translation of this image and the imagination it invokes is also a subject of the terminology. So both artistic images, humanities, humanism, and terminology are found in a companion website called Pandora Word Box. Please read these frames by stopping the motion. I'm not going to comment all of them, but only provide some verbal comments of the highlights. You can stop the flow of the video and read at your own pace. So here is an artistic depiction of individuals imbibing alcoholic beverages. And here you have the same action by a child. Alcohol is alcohol is alcohol is alcohol. So why do we make a distinction between alcohol drinking children, which in general is not legal in most civilized nations, and adults drinking? Is because the same agent has different impacts during different stages of development. The homeostasis of this child is different from the homeostasis of this elderly one. So, please read again. Because, for instance, anomaly implies that you know what is normal. If you know what is normal and you rely on statistics, it will say 95% of whatever X is considered normal. And anything that is 5% is abnormal. Well, within this 95%, there may be variants, that is, unusual forms of normal. And please, if you want to stop for a minute, I have to tell you that in medicine, in life, and statistics in mathematics, they don't get along very well. So just read this, please. So here then we have to underscore that most developmental anomalies are functional, Many are structural, but not as many. Before you have a change of structure, you have signs of malfunction. Developmental anomalies are frequent. They are actually more than 5%. So one could say that developmental anomalies in a normal human population are normal. They are so frequent that you could say is within the normal population. The leading cause of infant mortality is death, teratothanasia, because of very serious structural or functional anomalies. They can be familial, that is not the same like genetic. A family that drinks, father and mother may be drinking, and the babies may be dying, but that's not because of their genes. They can be non-familial or sporadic. So any cause, and I mean any cause, whether it's genetic or environmental, manifesting at any age can result in developmental anomalies. So to continue with this theme, birth defects, another frequent term, is obsolete term. Ignore it. Because some of these defects manifest late, not at birth, and the notion in itself is very stigmatizing. Nobody likes to be called an instance of a birth defect. We don't like to be called defective. There is another notion floating in the literature that there are major birth defects, minor birth defects. Forget it. Focus, are they informative? For instance, I think you can guess that this child probably has what's called Down syndrome. Well, what's the anomaly here? I don't see any anomaly. I see dysmorphic signs, but they are not birth defects. So what are these signs? What makes you think this is an instance of Down syndrome? Those are signs that are subtle. A picanthic fold, a little bit of a small nose, but is that all? Think about it. So then we come back to this little boy with his umbilical hernia. Sign is what is perceived, and signal is what we understand about the sign. This is objective, this is subjective. This depends how much you know. Well, I know that the hernia in African Americans is more frequent. Therefore, maybe it's not an anomaly. Maybe it's just because he's from African descent. But open your eyes. What else do you see? And again, I'm going to tell you that I will tell you later, but not now. So then, the teratology indeed is the study of the impacts of teratogens. They can be genetic in nature, environmental, like radiation. They can be even malnutrition. They can be prescription drugs. In other words, any cause. Any. And like any well-established discipline, teratology has principles. And you need to know them. You need to know, one, that the susceptibility to a teratogen depends on your genes. On the genes of you, but as well as on your mother's, because the mother will process the drug. She will process that alcohol in her liver. If she has a good liver, your damage may be avoided or minimal. If her liver is very, very weak, then perhaps the impact of alcohol on you may be different. Those are hypothetical interpretations. But what is for sure is that teratogenesis depends on the genotype not only of the fetus, but also of the mother. The next principle is that the susceptibility changes as you go through different stages of development. Aneuploidy happens just at the beginning of life. So you could say that whatever is wrong with this child started the day it was conceived. But here you have a lady that has no arms, no legs, and her mother took a prescribed drug. That is not due to genes, and indeed she has a baby in her womb, and all her babies will be not impacted by her problem unless she takes thalidomide herself. But here we have a different situation. Here is a baby that unfortunately broke through the amniotic membranes and got attached to the placenta, and the placenta virtually digested his face. So this is more like a mechanical result, an adhesion of a placental fetal adhesion. So you need to know how this relates to the developmental stage. Very early, at some point during embryogenesis, and this may be late in gestation. So let's continue. The third principle says that teratogens have specific manifestations. This lady has severe structural anomalies, but her intelligence is normal. In fact, she is a famous artist. So that this thalidomide has specific impacts on specific points of embryogenesis, but is not a general effect. Contrary to toxins, if you poison her, then she has generalized effects, because people should not confuse a teratogen with a toxin, because toxins have global effects. Here then we have the final manifestation of teratogenesis. For instance, mental retardation or altered growth, that is, failure to grow, or some specific malformations like here, or infertility, and so on. So that the four main end points of teratogenesis is death, which is very frequent, and that is called teratothanasia, malformation or structural problems, growth problems, and functional problems. The fifth principle says that dose, the concentration, the peak dose, the duration of exposure, all of these cause differences in phenotype, in manifestations. A woman who drinks alcohol 1 teaspoon is not going to have a baby like this. To have a baby like this, she would have to consume quite a bit of alcohol. So it has a notion of maternal fetal factors. Good liver, less alcohol will damage. Good liver will neutralize more alcohol than a poor liver. Maternal fetal factors. The sixth principle is that deviant development may differ in function of degree, dosage, duration, exposures from no detectable effects to total lethality, that is, teratothanasia. Now, all of this is explained in a 13-minute long video, and I think it may be good for you to look at it, because then you can remember easier these 6 principles, but that's up to you. So we are back looking at the same boy we presented a few minutes ago. We underscore that sign then is what we perceive, what we see, what we note. And signal is subjective. Sign is objective, but signals are not. Signals are when we transform a sign into a signal through knowledge. So it's what we understand the sign to mean. So that in here, in an African population, we have to decide whether this is a variant or normal. But let me underscore that if this hernia impedes the health of this child, it can never be normal. But then you also have to remember a principle that things tend to cluster. What else do you see here? This child's homeostasis, health, prognosis is compromised. This is a component of a syndrome that includes macroglossia, and therefore this child may have what's called a macroglossia omphalocele syndrome. Learn about it because it's a high cancer risk syndrome. Enough for that for now. We'll continue. What is fundamental is this statement. The greater the number of dysmorphic signs, no matter how subtle they are, no matter if they are variants or dysmorphisms, the more they have, the more they are concurrent, the more you will find a significance in it. There will be hidden structural malformations or functional dysfunctions, but the more concurrent, the more the trouble. I told you that health is an optimal homeostasis, and added to that is a sense of well-being. But you have to remember the circumstances. The well-being and the stability of a 95-year-old is not the same like a 15-year-old. What's normal for one is not normal for the other. Here is clinodactyly and a single transfer palmar crease, which some people call simian. This together with this, and a lot of little creases here, and little short fingers comparing to the length of the palm. All of this is one hand with multiple signs, and therefore a signal or a syndrome, things that run together. But this is only a hand, and you should not work on partial information. You should look always at the whole patient. So what does that mean, whole patient? You need to have a complete array of facts, signs, as much as you can. And it is relevant. The environment, where they live, the family, not only relatives, but just acquired family, the genetically related family members, how was the gestation, how was the prenatal period, the chronology of the signs, how do they emerge, how is it growing, how is the child developing, what are the symptom signs. All of these are facts. And then you build up a hypothesis. What is this a signal of? What is this associated with this? And what are these associations? Maybe there are one or two syndromes. We said this hand is a hand syndrome. A lot of things running together in the hand. Well, what's the mechanism? How do you make this? And what causes trigger the mechanism? And you begin to synthesize until you reach a hypothesis, and you call that a diagnosis. So all of this is within the domain of dermatoglyphics, skin with carvings, like your fingerprints. And if you follow this recommendation, then you extend your exam to the whole patient, to the family, to his environment. And what do you find? Excuse me. You find that actually there are many variants, many dysmorphic signs that may look innocent, like, let's say, this type of face or a little bit of round ears. But others are malformations, structural malformations, like heart defects or Hirschsprung disease. And you arrive at the conclusion that this is a syndrome, that this syndrome compromises the stability of this patient. And then you begin to look at pathogenesis and etiology. So we want you to be the best clinician that you possibly can, and a clinician that has open eyes to see signs and knowledge to interpret the signs into signals. But if you start with falsehood here, you're going to arrive at a disaster here. So to have good signs, you need to have no bias. You should not be looking for a diagnosis or looking for a cause. You should be looking at nothing other than the sign. Fact, fact, fact. And if you have signs, you need to measure them. And if those signs are left and right, you should look at symmetry. And if you have signs, you ought to look whether they are moving forward. What's happening? Are they going worse? Are they static? Or are they dynamic? And so that an examiner should not be looking for interpretations when he's collecting facts. Facts are facts independent of what you think they may be. Interpretation of signs should be avoided during data collection. That is one of the golden rules of semiology. The science of collecting signs, arranging them, organizing them, grouping them into syndromes, interpreting them later as mechanism and what is the possible cause of the mechanism, and synthesizes the whole thing into a diagnosis. Please read this. It will serve you well. So we mentioned the word teratothanasia, that is teratology linked with death. It is virtually a normal event, statistically speaking, because most of the teratologic events are lethal. They die before they are born. It is a spontaneous prenatal demise of the abnormal conceptions. This mechanism is triggered by intracellular events as well as extracellular reactions to these events, all along the downstream as the child develops from a morula, blastula, pre-implantation. This is when twinning and conjoined twins arise. And then once the conceptus implants, the placenta develops, the organs begin to form. That's when a lot of structural anomalies such as heart defects emerge. Many of them are lethal. These are mostly lethal. And then the fetus matures, the tissues become more differentiated. There are dysplasias when the tissues don't mature, and the frequency of teratogenesis decreases. So it can be said that virtually 90+% of those seriously flawed will not make it to these stages. So it is important that you remember that the leading cause of infant mortality are these sorts of pathologies. It is the main cause why we lose children. And most of them will die before birth. But even those who die after birth, the leading cause are flaws of development. So how do we organize our thoughts about these developmental issues? Malformation tends to be seen as a structural anomaly, but remember that functional anomalies precede malformation. There are dozens of functional signs before you have a structural malformation. And they can be single, limited to one field of development, let's say the nose, or can be multiple, and that is involved the whole body, like in the case of Down syndrome. They can be sequences, and that is like a cascade of anomaly, cascade that is this anomaly triggers this one and this one and this one and this one. So this terminology is very important because if it is a sequence, the pathogenesis is multiple. Each node has a different pathogenesis, but the etiology is the same. It's one. Or we can have factors that push the development and deform what's going on. So that inherently you know that the child and the history of drug that the mother consumed and so on is irrelevant. This is basically external forces. Not enough space, not enough amniotic fluid, not enough space for the fetus to move. Or, like adults, it can be a disruption. Everything is fine, but an artery exploded and killed the whole development in the whole area, and then the child is born without an arm. Vascular explosions or anomalies. And later it can be a dysplasia that all these cells are normal, but there are too many of some kind, not enough of another, and all of a sudden you get a tumor, you get a teratoma, you get a neurofibroma. Please read these statements. So to continue then, here you have an artistic depiction by a very famous physician, Dr. Joseph Warkeny. In fact, he almost single-handedly established modern teratology. It is very unusual for a single man to be given credit for a whole science of medicine. Here he is view of what a child with Down syndrome looks like. Sort of narrow, short nose, open mouth, hypotonia, protruding tongue, small round ears, and on and on and on and on. So, collectively, this face has concurrent dysmorphic signs, and you could say in medicine, a face that talks to you is called facies. And you could say, aha, this facies combined with this and combined with a heart defect, combined with a simian crease, concurrent with a crooked finger called clinodactyly, all of this builds up a case of guilty, you're guilty of having Down syndrome, huh? So, it is a signal. But signals are hypothetical. Signs are facts. So read this, please, and consider the implications. So we are back to this law that says the higher the number of dysmorphic signs, the higher the chance that there are concurrent significant health impacting anomalies. For instance, we just saw a face of Down syndrome. That is not where the impact is going to be. The impact is going to be that if that Down syndrome child has a bad heart, he may die. Or if he has no ganglion cells in the colon, he's going to have megacolon, and that can kill him, and so on and so on. And second point is that, as I said repeatedly, functional anomalies are more frequent than structural anomalies. And if you go to this child with Down syndrome, his functional anomalies of developmental delay far exceed in importance than the structural anomalies. A child with a heart defect and a very good intelligence is not the same like a child with a heart defect and a incapacity to develop the intellect. This is particularly dramatic in children that have the fetal alcohol syndrome. The degree of their impact on their brain varies, and there are no two children with the fetal alcohol syndrome alike. And some of them are born without any dysmorphic signs, just functional, just difficulties in living in society. So here they are. These are the little children, but they have a bad temper. They cry, they scream, nothing seems to please them, they're unhappy. Of course, some of them have structural anomalies, but the functional spectrum is enormous, and this is why it's called a spectrum, from minimal to maximum. The maximum, we know what it is teratothanasia. Alcohol can kill. And the minimum is a child that doesn't have any of these signs. It's just a child that doesn't grow, doesn't study, doesn't behave. It's sort of wild. A whole spectrum of functional. But there are also structural anomalies. And we mentioned humanism, we said Pandora word box, we said artists. Yeah, every patient wants to be I am. I am an individual. I am unique. I am a variable. I'm not just the same rubber stamp condition. Treat me, here I am. I am not a case of learning disability or a case of cleft palate. And this is the essence of a good clinician, to recognize that Down syndrome is a generalization, but each patient is I am. So where are we going to show you all these images and all these practicums and videos? We derived them from our clinical experience, which is summarized in the Clinical Eye Openers website. In general, we post one picture and we say, well, what do you see? What I see, you have to click and take a look. And we'll compare what you see here and what I see here, and then eventually we are going to agree on one common point of view. Here is I am. Here is a Down syndrome. How old is she? She's a young girl, but she looks prematurely senile. One of the signs of Down syndrome that you should know eventually. So all of these 2 points, humanism and clinical science, converge into Pandora word box. Here you have the clinical eye openers signs, and here you have how to reconcile that with humanitarian and humanistic points of view. And what do we want to convey to you with signs and signals? We are going to rely on preferential clinical prototypes. We're going to try to emphasize what is seen in these conditions so that by the time you are finished with the full navigation, not the brief one, but the full one, you would know a lot about these things. And you probably are going to know more about Down syndrome than many of your colleagues, including many of your instructors. So we're going to emphasize signs of Down syndrome, achondroplasia, Turner, neurofibromatosis, cancer risk, alcohol radiation, which in Ukraine is very important because of Chernobyl, neural tube defects, because the frequency of death due to these disorders in Ukraine, for example, is the highest in Europe. Now, I said at the beginning that clinical eye openers is not sufficient in terms of our contents to sustain a diagnosis and treatment protocols. You need to read facts, how to transform signs into signals from classic sources. This is a very classic book. It's a book of a century, they call it, a classic. Another classic is these, The Malformed Infant and Child. It's very good. So you should know about these books. You should take a look at them, and they are going to complete your medical knowledge to interpret signs. So we have reached the end of Module 1, and this opens options for you as to what to do next. If you want to have just a basic grasp of genetics, teratology, and dysmorphology, you can skip directly to Module 2. However, if you want to have a good grasp, a full grasp, or a fuller grasp of these notions, you have additional options. You could see modules, there are 4 of them, and any of the 4 supplements. This will help you to gain a deeper appreciation of the basics as well as to memorize their relevance.